Well, before you start, Alastair, can I start and just greet you and welcome you to Poland and really express our gratitude for you being with us and for you sharing with us this incredible part of experience and knowledge about trauma in a very specific cases of children, young children whose life should be really just, like wonderful story. And yet we know that there are so many children who suffer tremendously, so many children who go through terrible experiences of trauma. And it's incredible because you said that the title of your talk will be Understanding the Unthinkable. We'll obviously be very interested to know how you understand this, but to me, this is just a sign of touching upon some terribly disturbing themes, which is, yes, how we can make sense of something that it's unbelievable, just unthinkable, something that we would never wish to happen. So thank you very much. Honestly, this topic is especially very, very important for all of us to try to understand and share this understanding and help with this understanding while working with these young people. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for such a warm welcome, and to the panel as well. It's a great privilege to be here. Thank you so much for the invite, and hopefully this evening we can talk about some practical things that will support the work of everyone who's listening and attending. It's a great honor to be involved, and such horrific atrocities are happening, as you said, and so unnecessary. But we need to make some way forward in trying to support families and children and young people through that process. I'll share my slides and talk a little bit then about what we'll cover this evening. If there's a second to come up as a full slide, and great. So hopefully, can I just check you can see the full slide from here? That's perfect. So as Iga was saying, my name's Alastair Black. I'm a consultant psychotherapist, and I work for the Regional Trauma Network as part of the Belfast Health Trust in Northern Ireland. I guess that a lot of my work is working with children and young people who have been traumatized as a result of ongoing conflict in Northern Ireland. I also have experience of working with children and young people, child soldiers, with a project in the Democratic Republic of Congo during the war there, and also most recently working with Syrian refugees who have fled the war and are experiencing trauma when they come to a place of safety. The bulk of my work to date has been with man-made trauma, and I'm going to talk a lot about this and refer to it this evening because I think there's something distinctly different about trauma that is perpetrated by one human being on another, and particularly in the eyes of children and young people, how they can struggle to make sense of that. So as Iga has mentioned, I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about helping children and young people make sense of what they've experienced, certainly at the very early stages. I'm not going to talk this evening about the treatment of trauma. I think that is often something that happens a little further in the timeline. But I would like to talk a little bit about the space just before that, and how we can help all children and young people to manage what they have been through. I know we've probably got quite a mixed group of participants this evening, so I want to try and make sure everyone gets something that's useful. So for those clinicians that are joining us, what we'll be talking about this evening is probably the preparation and stabilization part before reliving treatment would begin to happen. And for those people that are not involved directly in clinical work, this is about setting up an environment where we can have discussions with children and young people to aid the natural process, hopefully, of healing and moving forward. Two things, I guess, just to say. One is that I want to try and keep things as practical as possible this evening. I am someone that works with children and young people, and I just want to speak to all of you as people who are also working with children and young people. So I want to give you something practical, hopefully to take away, and just to share some thoughts and ideas that I have found useful. I think trauma as an experience is 100% unique to the individual that has experienced it. And I think as a result of that, there are no perfect or tidy answers to dealing with this problem. But I think we can have some ideas, and we can choose from those ideas to help children and young people as well. I'm hoping to keep things very simple this evening. The way in which I wish to explain things is exactly explained in the same way that I explain them to children, to young people, and also to adults. Because I think it's important to understand that when children, young people, and adults experience trauma, their brain is often not working at 100% capacity, which means the information that we are giving them has to be provided in a way that they can digest. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So what I would like to focus on in the time that we've got this evening is on the post-trauma space. And I want to just explain what I mean by that. I mean the space where for some children and young people, they may be in a place of physical safety or in less danger has been introduced. And those children and young people, when they start to feel a little less under threat, they may want to start to make sense of the experiences that they have had. And the question I would like to address tonight is how can we, as a group of helpers, best facilitate this process? How can we set up an environment and relationships that will encourage children and young people to naturally make sense of what they have been through? And where they're not making sense of that, that we can come alongside and help them along. Just some thoughts about pacing and the speed and the way of which we move through this part of the trauma process. It is crucial that for children and the young people must lead this process. If we believe that trauma is a unique experience for each child and young person, we need to understand that they may very well move at a different pace and a different speed than maybe even children the same age, children that have had the same traumatic experience, or siblings in the same family. So we must be very watchful. We must pay attention to the speed that the children and young people can move, and ask them to lead us in how much information we give them and where we go with them in that journey. I love working with children. I think they're amazing. I think they're incredibly resilient. And I think it's nice to start from the point of view that we should expect recovery to happen for the vast majority of children and young people, given the correct, appropriate support. But what we want to do as a group of helpers, we want to look for some signs of stuckness. So if children are not progressing, if they stop moving through that recovery process, it's then that we want to come alongside and try and help them as sensitively as we possibly can. I think any intervention, any help that we want to give them should always start with the least intrusive and the least invasive. So we want to do as little as possible to allow that child or young person to start moving again. And this is for two main reasons. One is that we want that child or young person to feel that they are the person in charge of their recovery and they are driving that process and we are not doing it for them. And also to guard against overload and doing too much too soon when a child is not ready to take that on. So this protects their autonomy, their independence, and it also guards that we don't disrupt the natural process, that we don't get involved too soon and we don't do too much. And we don't actually make something that is a natural reaction to a horrible situation seem like something is broken whenever it's a normal reaction to a very abnormal situation. I think there's another big message amongst this as well, which is for all of us, we should not underestimate the value of all the small stuff, of all the small things that we do and take for granted. Often things like routine, care and support in a very consistent way, being able to be there for the child and young person whenever they need a person there, those things are of extreme value in this situation. And sometimes as professionals, we forget how important those smaller things are and we rush on to the bigger things. And it's really important that we put value in these small things as we move forward. So some of the things I would like to cover this evening, given time, is I'd like to consider the impact of multiple traumas and on multiple levels for this population of children and young people, because it's a very complex situation and it's hard for us to understand, therefore it will be hard for children and young people to understand what is happening. I'd like to explore how we as a group might be able to provide a framework that may assist in the understanding of their current experiences. And I think with the hope that recognition and ownership of those experiences, of validating them and knowing that they're okay, will provide a foundation for future processing of trauma and recovery. It also helps us as a group to begin to detect the children and young people who are not coping very well, not moving through a natural process of recovery. And this then lays down a future treatment foundation if it is required. Everything I'm talking about this evening is within evidence-based treatment and evidence-based principles. And it means then if treatment is provided, children and young people should understand some of where they're going and also some of the language that may be used. So what is it we're trying to understand? And I think this is a very, very important statement. It may not be possible ever to understand what has happened to us, but we can begin to understand what has happened in us, inside us. And that's what I'd like to focus on in the time we have this evening. Excuse me. That the idea that we could spend lots and lots of time trying to make sense of this horrific thing that is happening. But what is more valuable and a better use of the resources we have and more meaningful is help children and young people understand what's happening inside them, because that is something that we have some control over and some influence on. So what are some of the challenges we have ahead? If we accept that most all children exposed to trauma will have a psychological and emotional response, but also that only a smaller number should go on to develop psychological disorders, it's then very helpful for us to support natural processing, to look out for those whose processing is hindered or stuck. And we're looking really, when we look at this population, for two things. What we want to see is that over time, 1 hour goes down and 1 hour goes up. The symptoms begin to diminish, and functioning and happiness and the ability to function begins to improve. So symptoms go down and functioning comes up. And when we see that happening, we know that the natural recovery process is doing what it's supposed to do. Some of the challenges that we have, and I know that you will know this better than I do, in this context, the trauma may still be viewed as ongoing. It is factually ongoing in many ways. Often when we look at the textbooks for treating trauma, they often make the assumption that the person receiving the treatment is in a safe place and the trauma is finished, it is over. And that's not something we can say at the moment for this population, unfortunately. We know that the children and young people will have absent family and friends, and that may be absent family and friends due to bereavement and losses. It may be absent due to families being separated in different ways, and separated either during resettlement processes or separated being in different countries or different cities and towns. So again, the impact of that is ongoing for these children and young people. We know that as a group, future longer term plans may be uncertain, particularly for children and young people who may have left the country and are unsure about return, or left their environment and are unsure about going back and when that will happen. The human brain can deal with stress quite well when it knows when the end point is. And one of the challenges for this population is that there's no end point at the moment. It feels like it's uncertain and ongoing. We know the disruption, the social disruption of relocation, and the large numbers, enormous numbers of families that have been on the move. There can be a fear among children and young people that the war may follow them, even if they are in a place of safety. And we need to think, therefore, about how we measure the distress and the experiences of children and young people in this situation. Because if we take a population who are now completely safe, we would expect to see them to react in a certain way. But for this population who may not feel completely safe, who do not feel that the threat has yet passed, we need to be careful that we understand that some of their symptoms and reactions may still be appropriate because the risk is ongoing. As with all trauma cases, and as with all children and young people cases, it is crucial that we view each case in context and also each case as individuals, because it will always be unique. I think tonight about constructing a scaffolding. I think this is a useful metaphor or a model to think about, because it describes this part of the treatment process or the support process. What we are trying to do as professionals and helpers is to build a supportive scaffolding around that child or young person. We want that scaffolding to be built from the most basic level, meeting their basic needs, their physical needs, their environmental needs around them, their needs of their family and their community, but also building higher up to think about their emotional needs and their psychological needs. We want this scaffolding to be something that helps to contain them, to support them, that is around them and is constant. But we know that, like all scaffolding, it's a temporary structure that allows the building to be rebuilt behind that. And hopefully in the future, that scaffolding that we're providing will no longer be needed. Our role as professionals, as carers, as helpers, We want to assist the child and the young person in building their own scaffolding to give them that independence. We want a scaffolding that promotes psychological and emotional safety, that provides psychological and emotional containment, which means that they can experience psychological reactions and emotional upset and still feel that they feel safe and contained within that. We want to provide a scaffolding that we will be able to hang information on in a way that is meaningful for the child and the young person. As they begin to make sense of what is happening around them and to them, we need to be able to put the information in the correct order that will be most helpful for them to digest it and then move on. The scaffolding should enable the young person or the child to be able to move closer to talk about their experiences, but also to move away from it if they feel they need a break and some respite from that. And it's a scaffolding that is good enough for the moment. It's something that can be improved upon, built upon, and developed as we go on. We need to think about what can we do now that will make the most difference. So some maybe obvious points, but considerations of the barriers and the issues that may come up working with this group. And I'm thinking, I guess, about working from both the Polish and the Ukrainian point of view, and depending on where those children and young people are. So we could be looking at language barriers and the challenge around that. I'll talk a little bit later about how it can be very difficult to put trauma into our own language. That can be even more challenging whenever we're dealing either through translators or we're dealing with people from a different language and culture. There often can be other competing priority needs for children and young people. When we think about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, it's important that we attend to the basic needs before we think about the psychological and emotional needs. If we don't have that foundation, we will then start to unpackage things that we don't have a foundation that is strong enough to hold that up. It's highly probable that children may have very high levels of emotion, and that may be a block to communication and considering what has happened. It's too hot, it's too dangerous to go close to, and therefore the children keep the lid on the emotional box. The opposite can also be true, where we see psychological shock and numbing. So children become shut down, they become emotionally frozen. And because the emotions are frozen, it stops the natural healing process from happening. Concern for family members, either present with them or absent, can be a barrier to this natural healing process, because there can be a feeling that this is incomplete, or I don't deserve to have time to go into these issues because I need to worry about the person who's not here. Everything is new, everything has changed. I cannot begin to imagine what it is like for these families, with their whole world being not just turned upside down, but in some cases gone. And I think that that's an awful lot for a child or a young person to begin to accept and adjust to. So until some of that settles, it can be very difficult to move forward into the emotional and psychological world. We know with trauma, there's natural avoidance, and we would expect that to happen. And what we will find over the next period of time is trauma will be almost on a rubber band or a bungee. So sometimes it will feel like it's very close, and other times the children and young people want to push it away, and it will be far away, close, far away, close. And we have to allow that journey to happen so they can be used to that. We expect children and young people to be overwhelmed, and whenever people are overwhelmed, it can be very difficult to sort out the tangle of their experiences. And one thing that I have found interesting in a number of conflict situations is that I often see that children try and be perfect for other people, for the people around them, for their families. They will often suppress the emotions that they have been experiencing. They will try not to talk about it, not to trigger anyone else off, and with the belief that their family have been through enough without creating any more concern or worry. And this is something that we want to be extremely cautious about, because we know that trauma that is trapped and held under pressure is like a big spring, that the more we push into it, the more it pushes back against us, the greater symptoms become. So we want to give those children the permission in a safe environment to share their experiences.
Alastair, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I gather that there are some difficulties with access.
Okay.
And perhaps if you switch off your camera,
Okay.
it would be better, yes, better internet connection.
Okay. Let me see.
But what you say is so very important. It so often is being overlooked and is being misinterpreted.
Okay.
So it's very important to emphasize what you're saying.
Is that okay? My camera's off now. You can still hear me okay?
This is mainly with translators, so they can really fully grasp what you're saying. Okay. So this is a question for them.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just check?
Yes, yes, it's fine. It's fine. We can hear you very well now.
And is the pace, the speed okay, Magda?
Yes, the speed is perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so on the subject of communication, then we'll talk a little bit about how important the style of communication is for this group. And it's crucial that we're able to share information in a way that is, well, useful and accessible. So information with traumatized populations needs to be graded. We need to be able to work through it a bit at a time, as much as they can manage. Information needs to be accessible, so it needs to be understandable. And I know that as a clinician, sometimes we can make things very complicated. So it's really important that we make this accessible, not just for the age group, but for an age group that have an awful lot going on in their head. The information should be digestible in bite-sized pieces. We can trust children and young people to take information on, to go away, and then come back when they're ready for more information. So allowing them to lead that process. And everything that we share should be logical, should make sense. If it's not making sense, we're probably not explaining it correctly, or have made it too complicated. I think also it's really important that the information is memorable. And I want to talk about the use of models and diagrams this evening. That it's attractive, that it's friendly, and non-clinical in the sense that it's not overly technical. And the information that we're sharing with children and young people, it has to be appropriate, age appropriate for younger children, for adolescents, but also for parents and family members, because it's absolutely crucial that families have a common language that they can use together. And one of the things that I have learned working with families in following large traumas is that often the family becomes quite separated and can't understand what each other are going through. So having a common language and a means of communicating is very, very important. So the use of models or metaphor allow us to communicate complex information in a simple and efficient way. It enables children and young people to have a source of information that can be accessed at times of distress. And I feel very, very strongly about this, that there is no point giving children and young people information if it's so complicated, detailed, that whenever they're having anxiety or anger or traumatic intrusions, that they can't access the information whenever their brain is at most under pressure. Using models also allows us to have a framework that respects the uniqueness of trauma. It doesn't tell all children and young people that what they're experiencing is the same, but it gives them a context in which to put their personal experience. And I'm a huge believer in the more complex the problem, the more simple the model is that we should be using. The trauma that these families are experiencing is incredibly complex and complicated and multi-layered. So we do not want to add to that by adding something more complicated. We really want the models that we use to be simple and straightforward and accessible. I apologize for all those who are rat phobic, but I wanted to share this picture. My wife shared this with me, I think, during the week. This is Magawa. He is a bomb disposal rat, and he was in the media because he received a medal, which he has around his neck here, for detecting 38 landmines and 29 unexploded munitions. And the reason I'm mentioning him is that I think we have something to learn from him when we think about dealing with traumatized children and young people. Because the reason why the bomb disposal teams in Cambodia train rats to do the job is for two reasons. One is that they can sniff out and they can smell the explosives. And second of all, when they walk on the explosive landmines, they step so lightly that they don't trigger off the explosion. And I think that's a good lesson for us as people working with traumatized children and young people. We need to be able to sniff out the trauma and know what we're looking for, but we need to tread very cautiously and very lightly so that we're not triggering off large reactions, which will sit back the children and young people that we deal with. I really like the idea of being the opposite of trauma. So we know that trauma is horrible. We know that trauma robs human beings of control, of choice. It's overwhelming. It's upsetting. It doesn't make sense. And I think a good rule for us as helpers and professionals is that everything that we do with children and young people, we should try to be the opposite of the trauma experience. So we want to try and make things predictable, and that's boring things like making sure we're clear about when we're meeting children and young people, that we turn up on time, that we don't let them down. We want to be ordered, to bring some order to the chaos. So we want to make sure that we present things in an ordered way that makes sense to them. When I'm working with traumatized children and young people in the clinic, some of them request that I see them at the same appointment on the same day, in the same room at the same time, because they want that order and predictability. It should be logical because trauma doesn't make sense. So everything we talk about should make sense. Trauma happens often very quickly and unexpectedly. So we want our interventions to be paced, to be slow. If their head is moving really fast, we want our intervention and our conversations to be the opposite of that. Slow, lots of breathing, and modeling that slowing down behavior. We want our intervention to be calm. And if it can't be calm from the young person's side, we want to provide containment so that that emotion doesn't become overwhelming. Helping them to control that emotion, giving them some choice in how we manage things, giving them a menu of things we might want to do, to talk about or get involved in. And the big thing is giving them as much control as possible. There's an irony with trauma and children and young people, in that the more control and choice you give them, the more they will trust and open up. The less control and choice you give them, the more they will slow down. They will test the brakes all of the time to make sure they're there. So being able to emphasize this in whatever intervention we're doing is so crucial and valuable. You'll all probably be very familiar with the idea of the window of tolerance in treatment. So for those of you that might be less familiar with it, it's a very simple diagram. If we look at the red line, that's really the state of hyperarousal. So that's the state where children and young people may get into so much distress that they enter into flight or fight and into a highly anxious state. And we don't want them in that place because of what they have been through. We also don't want them in that place because they stop learning, they stop taking information in, and they stop processing in that place. The blue line at the bottom of the graph is that the hypoarousal line, which means that children and young people are shut down. They're not experiencing any or enough emotion. They're disconnected from their feelings, both physically and emotionally. So what we're trying to do in treatment is we're trying to keep these children and young people between these two lines. We want them to have enough connection to what they've experienced to be able to process it, but we also don't want them to be above the red line. So between the blue line and the red line, we try and keep them there. The reason I'm mentioning this at this post-trauma phase, what we're talking about this evening, is that I think this window of tolerance should be applied to every interaction we have with children and young people, that we should be reading their reactions to us to see, are they disconnected when we're having a conversation or a discussion, or are they overly connected and therefore getting overly aroused? And if that is the case, we need to maybe think a little bit about our scaffolding. For children that are overly aroused, we need to think about some containment around that. And for children that are disconnected, we may need to think about some work that gives them space to begin to reconnect to their bodies and to their emotions. Another type of window I just wanted to mention this evening is when I provide support to my colleagues who are working with trauma cases, I often hear them telling me that they have already covered this information with children and young people. So I've already told them that. I've already shared that information earlier in our contact. And I think it's important to remember that sharing information with a traumatized child or young person is a bit like trying to throw a ball through an open window. So the ball is information, and sometimes the window is wide open and we can pass it through quite easily. Other times the window can come completely closed and the ball bounces off and the information does not go in. Other times the window can be a little bit open and we need to work hard to get that information in. I think we need to be watching and learning how open or closed the children and the young people that we have contact with, how open and closed their psychological windows are. And sometimes if the windows are closed and the information bounces off, it's absolutely okay to repeat ourselves. And it's really helpful to cover the same information, sometimes more than once, because it can take a while for that information to get in there. So we shouldn't be afraid of sounding like a broken record sometimes, that we continue to repeat those things. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the brain. I'm just a Simpsons fan, so that's all this slide has really got to do with. I don't want to get into the technical stuff to do with the brain because it's really not my field, but a couple of important things to think about is that during periods of high stress and trauma, the circuitry, the plumbing of the brain, the circulation is deeply affected. And we know that certain parts of the brain will go offline and not work particularly well whenever a trauma has been experienced. So, for example, that the Broca's area of the brain that manages speech is likely to go offline during a traumatic, stressful incident. And this can have two implications for us. One is that the child or the young person may not have a narrative or a language to share what they've experienced because that part of their brain was not functioning well at the time. And second of all, whenever they're reminded and brought back to that event, they may equally struggle to access that language. We also know that the frontal cortex in the brain that deals with all our problem solving and our making sense of issues also does not work effectively during traumas. And that may lead to difficulty in actually making sense of experiences. And sometimes children and young people questioning themselves about why they reacted in certain ways in certain situations. I think it's helpful for us to know that we want to try and create an environment where the brain is working at its optimum level. And that is going to be as calming and containing as possible. But to reassure children and young people that it's okay if they don't have the words or the language to express what they have been through. And we might want to use more creative means around play and art and music and those issues that may not require words. I think this is a helpful model. If we think about the brain's ability to take in information, like the plug hole in a sink, and we think about information data being a large bucket of water being poured into the sink. If that bucket of water, the information, is poured in nice and slowly and evenly, the information goes into the sink, it clears through the plug hole very quickly, goes down the drain, and there's no problem. If, however, the bucket is poured in really quickly, we find that the plug hole cannot manage the amount of water, the amount of data that's coming in. And therefore, the water starts to back up in the sink. And this is often what we find psychologically with children and young people and emotionally, that there's been a backing up because the brain has not been able to process the information because it's been brought in too quickly. What makes matters even more complicated is that we have seen how the brain does not function well under stress. So in the case of trauma, the bucket of water is huge, it's full of data, and the plug hole begins to get smaller and smaller. The brain's ability to process that data is not good. And sometimes this is a helpful model for helping children and young people to understand why some things are stuck in their system. I know it's helpful for me as well to think about my communication style, that whenever I am communicating, whenever I'm pouring any water into the sink and sharing information, I want to make sure that's done in a very slow, careful, and considered way. I'll touch a little bit on freeze, flight, and fight reactions. I know this is something that you'll be familiar with, but I want to think about it in the sense of children and young people and helping them understand what they're going through and what they've been through. And one of the big messages that I think children and young people do not always understand is that the freeze, the flight, and the fight mechanism in the human being is 100% natural and 100% functional. I see lots of children and young people who are very hard on themselves and punish themselves because they have had these types of reactions. And they find a lot of relief from realizing that that is how their body is wired to respond. So we know that each freeze, flight, and fight will have a physical, a cognitive, a behavioral, and an emotional aspect. It's possible that these responses to threat can be re-triggered when the threat is recalled or misinterpreted. So if a child or a young person is in a place of safety and they have moved out of the threat and the risk environment, but they recall the risk, the brain can misunderstand this and they can have this flight, fright, or freeze experience even in a safe place. And it's something we need to be equipped and aware to spot and to manage, and also to normalize for children and young people that their brain is responding to old information, but is unable to distinguish between what is in the past and what is happening in the present, which in one way is a good definition of trauma, that the brain has got confused about what is in the past and is over, and is mistaking it for what's happening in the here and now. Just to share a little case example around this, not only does freeze, flight, and fight impact on the patient's ability to process traumatic data, so it gets stuck in what we call state-specific form. It's almost like a video recorder has recorded things in its rawest form, which we'll talk about in a second. But the interpretation of these responses can lead to longer-term issues, such as guilt, such as shame, and feelings of vulnerability. This quote is from a young man I was working with who was the subject of a sexual assault by a gang of his peers. And he chose to run away from the situation, which saved him from further trauma. But he became extremely distressed, extremely depressed, and a risk. And this was his quote: "Because I chose to run away and not to fight, then I believe I am weak, and therefore I'm still scared, and I feel vulnerable all of the time." And we had to spend some time together making sense that actually his reaction was the appropriate and normal reaction. I think this is part of what makes trauma truly complex, not just the horribleness of the trauma, but sometimes the misunderstanding by children and young people of what they have experienced and how they have reacted. And in this case, I think we can use gentle factual correction. And in CBT, we would talk about Socratic questioning. What would have happened if you stayed to fight instead of ran away? Would that have made the trauma worse or better? Would you have been safer or more in danger? And being able to gently correct children and young people's thinking can often help and avoid these feelings of guilt and shame that are unnecessary and can hinder the natural recovery process. I think this topic is a really interesting one based on the terrible context that these families find themselves in. And it involves, when is behavior hypervigilant, unnecessary and much, and when is behavior vigilant to keep us safe? I believe hypervigilance, unnecessary levels of vigilance and safety, can only be determined in the continued absence of threat. So essentially, hypervigilance are survival behaviors that are now out of date and no longer needed. They have become a habit. However, if the threat is still live, then it may be helpful to view the responses of these families in that context. I find it's helpful to have discussions with families around what behaviors can be given up and what behaviors need to be held on to remain safe. I describe this like a volume control, that this is not about a switch that goes on or off. I'm either safe or I'm not. Often with vigilance and hypervigilance, it's about turning the volume up or down. How much can we turn this behavior down that you still can feel safe, but that it doesn't interfere with your functioning or your mental well-being? If we're using scales to measure how children and people are feeling, even a simple 0 to 10 scale, we may want to consider that in a place of threat and risk where the trauma is still occurring, we are not going to get that scale down to 0. So we may want to reset the 0 at a 2 or a 3 or a 4 to get an idea where we're going. There's a term in trauma reprocessing work of ecological validity, meaning that the fear that a child or a young person or an adult is experiencing has to be measured against the context, the environment in which they currently are in. Okay, I'm conscious we're coming up almost an hour, and we'll take a little bit of a break in a second. I'll just talk a little bit about the rational and emotional brain, if that's okay, and then we'll take a break. I find this diagram really helpful, and I draw it out for children and young people to help understand what's happening in their inner world, and sometimes to help them make sense of their behavior. So we know that there are two interesting processes in our brain. One is the emotional loop, and the emotional loop in our brain is very fast. It's in charge of triggering our fight and flight responses, and it keeps us safe. It's the fire alarm in the brain. And then we have a slightly larger, longer loop in our brain, which is a rational loop. And it passes the information through a few other filters and helps us make sense of whether it's a threat or not. So to give a made-up example, if I was walking tonight down a dark alleyway and I bumped into a large man who didn't see me and scared me, my emotional brain would sound the alarm and my body would be flooded with adrenaline and I'd be prepared to fight or flight. But when the man apologizes and said, sorry, I didn't see you, then my rational brain reads that as it's not a real threat, and it balances the system out. There are some very important things for us all to understand about this model. The first one is that the emotional brain has to always fire first. If I stepped off the pavement in front of a bus, the emotional brain is the part of my brain that's going to get me back onto the pavement. I do not need my rational brain trying to figure out how big the bus is, or will the bus really hit me, or what color is the bus. I need the emotional brain to do its job. But in cases where we're making sense of trauma, the emotional brain does not always make good decisions and does not always read information clearly. If you'd like a personal example of this, you can think about the last time that you had an argument with someone you care about in your family. And you can think about saying something incredibly stupid that made the argument 100 times worse. That is a sign that you have been emotionally hijacked, that your emotional brain has taken over. Perhaps that's just me. I like thinking about this model like a seesaw, like balancing scales, because the brain is designed that when the emotional brain is activated, when emotion is raised, the rational brain goes down and disengages. Whenever emotions diminish and come down, we know that the rational brain will actually re-engage again. So they can't both be up and they can't both be down at the same time. And this is very helpful for children and young people to understand why they make emotional brain decisions, why they sometimes lash out in anger or fear or panic, because their emotional brain is triggering the danger system. And afterwards, when the emotion has died away, they're able to explore that with their rational brain and make more sense of it. What we are collectively trying to do as a group is we want the children and young people that we have contact with, we want this to be as even and balanced as possible. We want them to experience some degree of emotion to be able to heal, to naturally move through the process and to share things with us. But we also don't want that to overtake the rational brain that reminds them that they're safe, that they're supported, and that they can make sense of things. So we want to achieve a degree of balance. So it helps us manage hindsight thinking. I see lots of children and young people who say, I should have done this, I should have acted in this way, I should have said that, or I shouldn't have done this, or I shouldn't have done that. And often it's because their emotional brain has been activated that that wasn't a real choice, and they're looking back on it with a rational brain that they didn't have at the time. It helps them make sense of behaviors that are incongruent to their self-perception. I must be a coward because I ran away, whenever actually that was their emotional brain keeping them safe. It assists in making sense of emotional outbursts and emotional hijacks, and that is equally true of parents and of children. Parents can be extremely hard on themselves whenever they're emotional towards their children and say things that they regret. It supports children and young people to catch themselves in an emotional brain state. And this is the lovely thing about this model, is that if they can catch themselves in an emotional brain state, the rational part of the scale has already begun to come up. They're beginning to think about things in a more balanced way. It helps us as professionals put the behaviors in context. And with all work with trauma, we really want to think about dual attention. We want there to be emotional experiencing, but with a rational anchor. We want one foot in the experience and one foot in the safety around that scaffolding so they feel anchored. And that will be a crucial skill for future treatment if it's needed. I think we'll pause for a quick 5-minute break at that point to give our wonderful translators a little break. It's 5 past. If we start again just at 10 past, if that's okay, Iga. Just before we get back, Iga, is there any questions that anyone would like me to answer from the messages, or are you happy for me to continue?
What in a situation when there's a teenager that witnesses suicide of a loved one, of a close person? How can we support an adolescent and help them handle the sense of guilt and the freeze they experience? This is the first question.
Okay, thank you. There's a number of issues to be considered. The first issue, I think, would be depending on how much time has elapsed since they have witnessed the suicide, the trauma. There's clearly 2 parts, at least, that the young person is experiencing. There is the horror of witnessing this event itself, and then there's the interpretation of what has happened. If we find that there's a sense of guilt has begun to show up and to be experienced, it would be helpful to gently explore the thinking behind this. Guilt in human beings and in young people generally will manifest following the breaking of some of their internal rules. So they will feel in some ways like they may have done something wrong or let someone down. In the case of a suicide, we know that there's lots of unanswered questions, perhaps. And it can be common for young adults to mistake or get muddled up between I wish I could have done something and I should have done something. This is only a small difference in wording, but a huge difference psychologically speaking. It is perfectly natural to feel that I wish I could have done something, but if the young person has misunderstood and felt that they should have done something, then that will lead to guilt and potentially to risk. We know that young people that have witnessed these type of events and are close to someone who have taken their own life may also be risk of repeating that behavior themselves. So being able to provide an emotional support, a safe place in which to explore the experience, recognition of where they are in their traumatic experience. If they're having lots of reliving and lots of images, it will be very difficult for them to make sense of their thinking. and they may need some help to allow that to settle, to make sure that their self-care, their sleep, the basics are looked after, so that they can then begin to address where that guilt may be coming from. Of course, there may sometimes be cases where the guilt is due to the fact that the young person may feel like they have factually let this other person down. But often in those cases, the way in which they have let them down gets magnified and enlarged, and that can be shrunk down, like the volume control we talked about earlier, and they can begin to digest that. I hope that answers some of that question for that very difficult situation. Are there any further questions you would like to consider before we move on?
Yes, there's also another question. Now, does the capacity of the brain to confuse events, is it the characteristic feature of children without the experience of trauma?
If that question is to do with confusing the past and the present in that way, I think that is definitely a characteristic of trauma. I think children, rather than young people, tend to think in quite concrete rather than abstract terms. So there are very firm lines between the past and the present for children, and that can often become blurred very easily. I think children are not particularly skilled at recounting time, so sometimes things can become quite blurred. I think there's a difference that would be worthwhile clarifying, that sometimes the timeline in traumas become muddled. Sometimes the timeline have missing sections for children and young people. Sometimes they believe some things happen before other things, because often those timelines are constructed after the trauma and not at the time. But one of the main characteristics of trauma will be that the brain mistakes the past event to be happening today and now. And that is the difference between remembering and reliving. Remembering is when we look back on a past event and we may have an emotional response to looking back on it. But reliving is that the brain mistakes that the event is recurring. It has the same chemical response, and therefore the physiological reaction is identical for when the trauma was actually happening. And that is highly problematic for this population because the brain is very, very confused. And in trauma work, we think about updating the trauma memory to give those children and young people some way of making them feel anchored in the present so that they can be concretely anchored and begin to differentiate between past and present. And thank you for that question.
Można jeszcze jedno pytanie?
May we have another one?
Yes, absolutely.
Jak pracować z dzieckiem?
How do we work with a child whose parent is fighting in a war, on a war? The child knows that the parent's life is in danger.
I imagine that's a very common question at the moment and a very common problem. I think what we know about children and young people and trauma is that children and young people need accurate, appropriate, age-appropriate information. What has happened in the past is often adults try and protect children from upsetting situations, and in a way of doing that, they actually remove information. I guess, as we've talked a little bit earlier this evening, children need information to make sense of what's happening to them. And we need to be careful that's the right information and the right type of information. If we do not give children information, they will fill the gaps themselves. And often they will fill those gaps with worse information and more upsetting information than factually may be happening. It must be impossible to protect children from what is happening around them, media information, adults talking. Children also talk to each other and will be hearing different things as well. So I think where a child has a parent who is in an at-risk situation where they're fighting at the front line and their life may be at risk, I think it's important to be able to recognize those fears, to try and make sure those fears are not magnified or exaggerated or ruminated and looping around those fears, that the child is able to have a space to explore them, that the child can, in any way that they can, have a practical input to that. They may want to be writing letters for their father. They may want to be, for a time when communication is able, they may want to be keeping a diary. They may want to be thinking through some of just those ways in which they can reconnect with their father again. I think the question about, is it possible that they may die? I think that's a very frightening question. I think it's something that will be uppermost in children's minds anyway. But it's really important that if we think about that sentence, my father may die, what children will tend to focus on is the dying part. What is more helpful for us to focus on is the might part, because that's not 100% the outcome. And therefore, it's important we maintain the balanced view we talked about earlier, about trying to make sure that it is discussed and explored in a balanced, a non-catastrophic way as well. The other part of this is if we do not share appropriate information with children, if they do suffer a bereavement, it makes it all the harder for them to manage and understand what's happening. So I think the information needs to be bite-sized, as we talked earlier, age appropriate, giving the child or young person, depending on the age, as much information as they can tolerate, making sure that they've understood it correctly, and giving them a space to deal with the emotional response that might come as part of that as well. Happy to continue with, I think, about 20 minutes left, if that's okay. So my slides have jumped around a little bit. I think what we'll maybe do is I'd like to draw a couple of diagrams, if that's okay, if technology will behave. So I'm going to stop sharing and share a whiteboard, if I can. Can I just check with the panel that whiteboard has come up okay? Great, thank you. Okay. Mm-hmm. Just because we're running a little shorter of time, I'd like to share two different models that I draw for children and young people together. And I do this with children, and I also do it with young adults as well. The first one is to help them understand what's happening if they're having a trauma reaction and trauma symptoms. The second one is more to help them think about multiple traumas and how traumas build up over time. So the first model that I'd like to talk about, I call the SIV model. And it's based around viewing the brain like the sieve that we use whenever we're cooking. So I will just do a very bad drawing of a sieve. Okay. So we in this model think about the brain as being like a big sieve. The brain is filtering information. One of its main jobs that it has to do is to deal with data that's coming in on a regular basis. So in normal day-to-day living, these arrows represent all the information that our body is putting through our brain. So all day long, our system is hoovering up data through sights, smells, sounds, sensations, emotions. It's collecting all of this information, and it all must pass through the sieve, through the filter of the brain. When the brain passes this information through the filter, it has two options. One option is that it can put it in a filing cabinet system over here, which it retains information that the brain feels is useful, that has been learned during the day, that is processed. Because the filing cabinet has only got a certain amount of space, the brain has to have a second option, which is it places the other information in a rubbish bin, like on our desktop. So when the brain is functioning in a healthy person in the way that we want it to function, data comes in, it passes through the sieve, the brain decides, do I keep it in the filing cabinet? And what I don't need, I discard and throw in the rubbish bin. We think that a lot of this probably happens during the night whenever we're dreaming as well. The brain is processing this information. And this is all fine until we experience a trauma. And so if we think about a trauma occurring for a child or a young person, represented by this big red arrow, this trauma is really full of data and information. It is crammed full of sights and smells and sounds and emotions that are particularly horrific and upsetting and disturbing. So the problem is that this then blocks up the filter. It blocks the sieve. It's too big to get to the filing cabinet, and it's too big to be put into the rubbish bin. And the filter becomes blocked. The sieve becomes blocked up. So the brain has to find a different place to store this traumatic information. And from a neurological point of view, this is in several different places in the brain. But it takes this information and it locks it away in this time capsule to one side, which allows the sieve to continue to function in day-to-day living. Now, like the rest of our physical body, the brain is designed to heal itself and to right itself. So the brain frequently opens this time capsule of information and tries to pass it back through the sieve to get it to the filing cabinet or the bin. The brain knows that this information is in the wrong place and it wants to file it away properly. But because the information is so big, is so laden with information, the trauma, it's so horrible, and it's still so big, it gets stuck in the sieve again. The brain chokes on this information and puts it back into the time capsule again. So we have this looping effect happening, that the information is opened up, tries to be forced through the sieve, doesn't work, it gets put back into storage, and then the brain opens it up again. This is a really helpful model to help children and young people to understand what's happening with them, because this loop, these blue arrows, describe post-traumatic reactions. These are flashbacks, these are nightmares, these are intrusive thoughts, these even could be feelings of or responsibility. What is happening is the brain is opening this information up, and because it can't digest it, it's going round and round. And the experience of trauma for children and young people is that feeling of reliving over and over again, about being stuck in that process. The most important thing about this model is that it places the emphasis on the trauma. It does not place the emphasis on the sieve. This person's brain, their sieve, and what it's doing, reopening that information, is natural, is trying to heal, and is actually doing all the right things. The problem with this issue is actually that the information that's come in, the trauma, has just been too big. It has overwhelmed the system. And it's good for children and young people to hear that there's nothing wrong with how their brain is working. It's trying to heal itself. It's just that they've experienced too much too quickly. It's like the bucket being poured into the sink we talked about earlier. This idea, this concept that we unfortunately have poured in too much information too soon. So, sorry, 1 second. The other thing that I think is quite important here is the idea that if we draw a line here, sorry, my pen has disappeared. If we draw a line here, it's very important to make a difference between what is happening on both sides of these lines. If we think about here, by the filing cabinet, that is remembering, as we were talking about in the case example earlier. So the idea that when I open the filing cabinet, I think of a memory, I can bring that information out, I can have emotions attached to that, and I can think about it in detail. But I am accessing it, I am bringing it out. It hasn't gone away as a bad memory, but it is under my control. When we think about here, on this side of the line, what we have is not remembering, we have reliving. And reliving is that raw looping of information that feels like it's happening in the here and now. And it's extremely important that we can tell the difference between those two things for a child and a young person. So I think that's a helpful model to be able to draw, to be able to share. I certainly know with the children and young people I work with, that they retain these pictures in their head more. And it also gives us a language to talk about, do we think this information is on the right side of the sieve? Do we think it's in the filing cabinet? Are we trying to get it to the bin? Are we trying to hold on to it? So it gives us a common language to talk to around that. So let me just draw a second model. I'm just conscious of our time as well. So this second model is called the bottle model, and I will draw a bottle here just to explain, and it helps us work through with children and young people the thoughts about multiple traumas, which this population will undoubtedly have experienced. So this can be whatever kind of bottle we want it to be. I talk about the Coca-Cola bottle model. I'm hoping that Coca-Cola will sponsor me at some stage and I will retire a very rich man from this process, but as yet, no luck. So we talk about, as human beings, we're all like big bottles, big 2-liter fizzy drink bottles. And all of us have a certain amount of liquid in the bottom of our bottle, because we all have difficult things have happened in our life and things that are upsetting for us or things that are painful for us. As long as the liquid in the bottle is at this low level, that is absolutely fine, because I can shake this bottle as much as I want and that liquid is going to fizz up and it's going to fizz down again without spilling out of the bottle, because it's got the space and it's got the time to expand and contract. We start to run into difficulties when the level of the liquid in the bottle starts to rise. And that can happen for one of two ways for children and young people. It can either rise very, very quickly by a huge trauma that happens to them unexpectedly. And it is possible for a child or a young person's bottle to be almost completely empty and one incident to make it completely full. So it can go from empty to full within one incident, within a second. The other way in which the bottle can increase, the liquid can increase in the bottle, is that trauma by trauma, day by day, month by month, time can go by, and a series of small traumatic events can also fill the bottle. What we know is that our brain doesn't really care how that bottle has filled up. It only cares about how full the bottle is. If we have a very full bottle right to the neck, the liquid has come right to the neck of the bottle, we have two major problems. One is that it takes very, very little of a shake for this bottle to spill over and to foam up. So these children and young people who are full of trauma, often the slightest external trigger can cause them to react and to overflow, emotionally speaking. The second problem that we have is if something for this young person with a full bottle here triggers off the liquid at the top of the bottle, this most recent small incident, let's say it's a row with their parent or a row with a friend, when we shake the bottle up, it's not just this little bit at the top, this small trauma that comes out, it is all this other trauma that's stored underneath that also comes out when we shake the bottle up as well. And that is incredibly problematic because what we then get is a child or a young person that is having an enormous emotional response to what can often be a relatively small trauma or event that has happened in their life. And that can be very, very difficult for people around them to understand. So I think this is a useful model to give a common language to children and young people. I know that when I talk to my patients, we often talk about how full is your bottle today? What's in your bottle? What kind of things can we do to decrease that? I think that a couple of the key messages that we have to think about as a group working with children and young people with trauma is how can we create that scaffolding that we talked about earlier that can prevent this child or young person's bottle being shook too much. So that boring, predictable, routine, consistent, dependable environment that does not cause any unnecessary shocks or shakes. The other thing that we can think about is either by sharing, and when the young person feels ready to share some of their experiences, that some of these experiences in the bottle can be removed and the level of the bottle can go down. Also, we can force the level of the bottle down or remove some of the stress in the bottle by engaging in positive activities. And these positive activities can be anything that gives that young person pleasure, sense of control, sense of accomplishment, and that helps them counteract some of the things in the bottle. So having a conversation about, we may not be yet ready to unpack some of the things in the bottle, but what are the things we can do to try and manage it better? Physical exercise is hugely important in traumatized populations because there's a physical element to the trauma that needs to be burned off. So things like that, art, music, being able to do those things, the importance of play and allowing children to be children and young people to mix with young people to be able to let off this stress in an age-appropriate way. I would caution and warn children and young people that it's really good to start to spring clean mentally some of these things out of the bottle whenever they're ready. Because whenever this information is kept under pressure for long periods of time, it stops becoming a series of different traumas and all becomes stuck together. And when it becomes stuck together, it's either all out or it's all in. It can be very, very difficult to tolerate in that way. I find it very useful with traumatized children and young people not to do a trauma history in the traditional sense of the word, but I favor trauma lists. So we can work through the bottle and give each one of these traumas a name. So the school trauma, the home trauma, the family trauma, or we can give it a letter or a number or a symbol, but we can start to acknowledge what the different traumas are and begin to then work and separate them out. And that's back to what we talked about earlier about giving a sense of control, a sense of choice. We know how children and young people then can start to see what's built up. Best of all, I think this model helps children and young people to realize why they're feeling often very bad, because they often won't have realized that some of these things have built up over time. We can see the big traumas really easily and in a really straightforward way, because when a big trauma happens, everyone around us is aware. People will give us support, sympathy, understanding. But these smaller traumas that often happen, these secret traumas or things that are very personal, often no one sees those. And children and young people will question, why am I feeling so bad? So being able to figure out what's in the bottle can often be the answer to the question, here's why you're feeling so bad. It's not down to you. It's down to all of these experiences. I would feel horrible if I had all of those experiences. And therefore, what can we do to try and make life a little easier for you? Not to shake the bottle, to try and engage in things that will help you feel better, and in good time, allow you to share some of those things in the bottle so you feel better. It's a very helpful model as well to share with parents, because parents will often not understand why children are responding the way that they are and behaving the way they are. And I would also say that there's a double bottle model, because I encourage parents to make sure that their bottle is as empty as possible. Because if you have a parent who's very full and you have a child who's a very full bottle, then those two are going to knock against each other and they're going to react in a very messy way. Also, as therapists or helpers, we need to make sure that our bottle is very empty, because we're going to be taking on some of that negative information from these children and young people, and we cannot afford to react in a way that may be unhelpful for them. So hopefully those two models are useful in moving forward in the work that you are doing together. Just going to stop sharing for a second. I do think that it's really important to bear in mind some of the things we've talked about today, that children and young people, given the right support and the right environment, should be able to move forward and do well. And that will allow us to watch out and dedicate our resources to those children and young people who may not be doing just as well as time progresses. Recognizing the context that these families are still living in an at-threat environment, and we'd expect their symptoms, therefore, to be much higher than normal from someone who's experienced a trauma and now is in a place of safety. I think remembering to not undervalue the small, consistent things about being the opposite of trauma, and slowly encouraging children and young people to share their experiences, and if need be, if they're stuck, for us to gently correct those with facts and questions to make sure they've got the right information. It's important to let children be children and young people to be young people, and allow people to have a sense of community, whether that's in the community that they have come from, the temporary community that they find themselves in, or also possibly a new community if that's what they're moving into for the time being. And that's really important. So children and young people will find a way to manage these things if we help them and allow them to do that. We're just about out of time. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Sorry for the slight technical glitch in the middle. And I hope what we have shared today has been helpful and will be helpful for the incredible, valuable work that you will all be doing moving forward, and the long-term piece of work that you'll also be doing. I just think that everything that you're doing and the people that are attending here and the investment that you're making, it's hugely admirable. And I'm really happy to help out in any way that I can. And I wish you every best in that future work.
Naprawdę to my chcieliśmy bardzo, bardzo.
It is we that would like to thank you very much. This time indeed passed on very quickly with so many key, crucial topics touched upon in order to interpret what's happening with children. The signals that they are sending out are very often confusing to us, and they can be distorting our awareness. So the awareness of what may be happening is crucial, and all the various ways, these practical models of work. Thank you, Alastair, very much for sharing these very specific tools that you use. Yes, tools which I assume can be very helpful for children as well, but also for their parents and for us, as you said, that we need to remember about those delicate bottles and that if we fill them too much too quickly, that will not serve any good. So we need to remember that as well, that we need to take care of ourselves in this context as well, and that which will be crucial in how we will work with kids and with the young people. We hope that we will meet again. We would like that very much. We've had some exchanges already, you know, and we are planning to take care of the topic of children, which a child doesn't necessarily name what they're experiencing very precisely, specifically. We have a lot of such children in Poland, but also Ukrainian children. So there's a lot of work to do. We will come back to you, Alastair, but thank you very much for today, and it's a great portion of information and tools to be applied. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Wszystkich bardzo prosimy o wypełnienie.
To all of you, please fill out a short evaluation form. We want to know if we fit your expectations and whether this is something that is helpful to you. Thank you, Mr. Professor, again. Professor Black, thank you, and see you soon. Thank you for today. Let's have a moment. Let's empty our bottles for the day. Let's take care of ourselves and let's resume acting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Dobry wieczór.
Dzięki, dobry dzień. Dziękujemy bardzo.
Thank you very much.